think it's not becoming necessary, but it is still a tradition, so we ring the bell. Welcome everybody to the Library of Mistakes. There's lots of new faces here tonight, so you're very welcome, delighted to see you. So I'll just explain a little bit about the library and the charity that owns it before I hand over to our guest speaker this evening. So the Library of Mistakes is a free public library. It's open 9 to 5, Monday to Saturday. If you'd like to come along, please go to the website, register as a reader. You're here, so you probably have already registered as a reader, and then you can arrange a visit. There's a tab for arranging a visit, and you're welcome. If you don't like our books, bring one of your own. We're a public library. You'll now know that you get invited to these lectures. There's also a podcast on the same subject matter, which broadly is financial history, and you can listen to that in all the usual sources. The charity that runs this library supports it through donations, but also through running a course in financial history called The Practical History of Financial Markets, which has been running for 20 years now. You can do that in person. We'll be in London in November. And you can also do it online. There's an online version of that course. If you think you need to know the practical history of financial markets, then that's available. So welcome back. Summer is over. People in Edinburgh are asking, did it ever begin? But it is now over. So it's back to money, finance, and debt. So tonight we're delighted to have Martin Barnes here to discuss the debt supercycle. Martin has been an economist in the real world for nearly 50 years, which is pretty impressive, particularly as he very rapidly got into the financial services where his job was advising portfolio managers, which, well, we could maybe discuss that over a beer later. Let's say it's a challenging way to make a living because I'm in the same business. And over 50 years of advising the private sector. He's also been watching the build-up of this, the debt supercycle, and now he poses the question, is it coming to an end? Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Russell. Well, it's really a great pleasure to give a presentation in this amazing library. Congratulations, Russell. I think debt is a very appropriate topic to discuss here. Debt is not evil. Our modern economies couldn't survive without it, but its misuse is responsible for most of the financial mistakes that this library is named after. I mean, the shelves here are filled with stories about the catastrophic effects of excessive leverage, whether you're talking about the 18th century South Sea bubble, the 1929 Wall Street crash, the 1970s Latin American debt crisis, or more recently, the burst US housing bubble, 2007 through 8-9. And now, of course, the current worry, concern is about the extreme level of government debt in many other developed economies. So I'm going to start with three very important quotes, I think. Well, interesting quotes. So the first one, if you can't read it at the back, I, however, place economy among the first and most important of virtues, and public sector debt as the greatest of the dangers to be feared. Thomas Jefferson. That was a while ago. So this concern about government debt is hardly new. When he was president in 1801, US government debt was $83 million, 6 million people, so it worked out around about $350 per person in today's money. Now we have $28 trillion of publicly held debt in the US, which works out at around, I think it's like $83,000 a person. So Jefferson must be truly rolling in his grave at that one. The other quotes was James Carville, advisor to President Clinton, who's basically said if he believed in reincarnation, he used to think he'd want to come back as the president or the Pope, but now he would want to come back as a bond market so he can intimidate everyone. And then, this is my favorite economic quote of all time, very simple yet incredibly profound, by Herb Stein, a US economist now no longer with us. If something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Very simple concept, but people kind of forget it. I'll come back to these two quotes later on. But there has been an extraordinary rise in both private and public debt in recent decades. So this chart here shows the trend in US private non-financial debt as a share of GDP. Back to 60. I could have gone back further. So really dramatic increase, as you can see. Now, debt growth was actually really strong back here in the 50s and the 60s into the 70s, but GDP was also growing very rapidly, so that ratio didn't rise very much. I guess back in the 50s and 60s, it was real economic growth was strong after the war, the baby boom generation, a lot of pent-up demand. And then in the 70s, a lot of inflation, so that boosted nominal GDP growth. So debt, although it was growing, wasn't really a problem. But then beginning in the early 80s, it took off relative to GDP. So debt was growing much faster than the economy. Now, a lot of my charts and data, I'm afraid, are going to refer to the US. And that's mainly because that's where I've had the best data access, and that's really what I've spent most of my career looking at. But a lot of the points and remarks and analysis applies to other countries too, including the UK. So what explains this rise from the early 80s? Well, a big factor was financial deregulation. The young people in this room, there are some, have grown up in an era where money grows on trees. Credit is easily available. The old geezers like me will remember that back in the 60s and 70s, credit was tough to get. It could be. You had to go begging, crawling on your knees to a bank to get a loan. God, I got married in 74. I had a decent job. My wife had a good job. We went to get a mortgage on our first home, a hugely expensive £8,000, I think it was, or maybe £8,500. Went to a building society. We were credit worthy. Oh, you don't save with us, do you? Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't you start saving with us, come back in 6 months to a year, and we'll talk about a loan. And that's what it used to be like. You just couldn't easily get credit. And then with financial deregulation, everything changed. All of a sudden, money was available. Banks were happy to lend. They felt that they could price risk better. There was derivatives. There was all kinds of stuff. You could argue the pendulum swung too far. But anyway, the supply of credit mushroomed. And if the supply's there, it created the demand. Then, of course, inflation fell dramatically in the 80s, so interest rates fell. So debt was cheaper. So the combination of deregulation and falling interest rates explains a lot of that, but it wasn't the only thing. There was a rather more insidious, nasty thing going on behind it, and the role of policy, which kind of fed this. And that's really what the debt supercycle story was all about. The company I worked for, it was called the Bank Credit Analyst in the old days, it's now called BCA Research, coined the term the debt supercycle in the early 70s to kind of explain how policy played a role in this rise. Okay, so we have to go back even further in history to really explain this. So this goes back to 1875, and it's the top part of the chart is the annual change in real economic growth, and the bottom chart is the annual inflation rate in the US. You can see a rather dramatic difference after the war, after the Second World War. In the previous period, everything was so much more volatile and a lot more stable after. So the pre-war period, it was a true laissez-faire economy. There were no automatic stabilizers. There was no deposit insurance and unemployment benefits and pension payments. You didn't just have recessions, you had depressions. You had as much deflation as you had inflation. When the economy went down, everybody, you had the same kind of human emotions, booms, excessive leverage, etc. But then when the economy went down, people went bust. The lenders went bust, the borrowers went bust. And the good thing about that is it cleansed all the excesses out of the system. Very painful, a bit nasty, but it meant that when the depression ended, or the recession ended, you started the next cycle with clean balance sheets. You'd washed out all the crap, basically, technical economic term. But then you had the 1930s Great Depression, the big one. And governments at that point decided, whoops, we better not let this happen again. So then they started to introduce what are called automatic stabilizers, things to smooth out the cycle, deposit insurance to stop banks going bust so easily, unemployment benefits, so if you lost your job, you had some income. And this was all given legitimacy, if you like, by the work of John Maynard Keynes, who showed a theoretical analysis of why it made sense for governments to run budget deficits in recessions. He also said they should run surpluses in boom times, but governments didn't care about that. But anyway, it all worked really well. And in the 50s and 60s, they expanded welfare systems with more health care and social benefits. So you can see after the war, we still had a few recessions, but they're kind of peanuts compared to these downturns, and no more deflation. No more deflation. I mean, the recession of after the housing bubble burst, the great financial meltdown, they call it, 08, 09, that's the last, it's the second last blip on that chart there. It's looked like nothing compared to what happened before, yet it was the worst recession in the post-war period. So policy made a big difference. We no longer cleansed balance sheets. The downside of this was we smoothed out the economic cycle, but it meant that in the downturns, you never washed out all the excesses. You never got rid of the crap, going back to my technical term. So it meant that each new cycle began with a higher level of indebtedness because you never cleansed it out completely. And each time each new cycle began, it got more and more. And the higher debt got, the more vulnerable the economy was to downturns. So the authorities had to get ever more desperate to prevent the system cleansing itself. I mean, if you let the system work on its own, it would cleanse. I mean, the market system does work, but government intervention stopped that. And the classic example of the debt supercycle at work, you could argue, was in the late 1990s when the tech bubble burst. And in the US, the government was very fearful that this would lead to a big deflation. They had looked at the experience of Japan after their massive real estate bubble burst at the end of the 80s. They went in for a decade of deflation, catastrophic economy. Greenspan talked a lot about this. So what the Fed did was it kept interest rates really low after the tech bubble burst for years, even as the economy was doing fine. In fact, it was very little recession at all after the tech bubble burst. But the Fed kept policy very easy. What happened? We had the housing bubble. So they prevented one crisis, but just put fuel in for the next one. And that was a much bigger one than the tech bubble. And then that one burst. And this is where the story takes an interesting twist. So we kind of always wondered where the limit to debt is. You know, what is the limit to consumer debt? I don't show it here. I've got some great quotes from people back in the 50s and 60s saying that debt was too high, can't go any higher, it was a disaster. And that's when debt was down here. But we found the limit. We actually found the limit at the end of 2007. That burst housing bubble basically ended the consumer sector's love affair with debt. If you lose your house, or you nearly lose your house, or you see your friends and neighbors nearly losing your house, that has a kind of that's a big deal in terms of your attitude towards debt. It's a bit like the 30s. I'm not that old, but my understanding is that people who lived through the 30s hated debt for the rest of their lives. Very, very financially conservative generation for the remainder of it. It's only us baby boomers that kind of went berserk, but the generation before us hated debt because of the memories of the 30s. I'm not saying that things were as bad this time as in the 30s, but clearly something's happened here because the ratio of household debt to income peaked at the end of 2007 when the housing bubble burst and has collapsed. It's back to levels not seen for more than 20 years. And that's despite zero interest rates. This decline happened when the Fed was keeping interest rates at zero. So this tells me that the authorities had lost their ability to persuade people to take on more leverage by just pumping money into the system. Because it had always worked in the past, and it stopped working now. And if consumers are not going to borrow and spend, well, it doesn't make a lot of sense for companies to do it either. So in the right-hand chart there, you've just got the percentage of small businesses who are borrowing. So a big, significant change in private sector attitudes towards debt as a result of that burst bubble. I actually wrote a piece for BCA Research in end of 2014 pronouncing the death of the debt supercycle, and a picture of a gravestone with RIP debt supercycle on it. It's pretty cool. But it didn't really die, actually. It didn't really die. It morphed. So that top chart is just the private debt to GDP that I showed before on a more stretched out scale. So if consumers, us, we wouldn't borrow and spend, guess what? The government will do it for us. So the debt supercycle basically just moved from the private sector to the public sector. So again, public debt as a share of GDP, and again, this is the US, was pretty flat, up to the period that the housing bubble burst. It had its ups and downs, but it took off after that. There was massive bailouts and handouts during that recession, and of course another round of handouts and bailouts because of the pandemic. So the debt supercycle is alive and well and living in the public sector. What about other countries? Well, the UK's story is pretty much the same. The orange line is public debt to GDP, same trajectory as in the US, and you can see the private debt to GDP. The blue line is falling dramatically since the 2008 period. Not so pronounced, but similar in the euro area, or some euro area countries. The euro area covers a lot of different experiences across, so a bit hard to generalize about the Eurozone. There's some very fiscally responsible countries in the euro area, but not all of them. Japan it went through this a decade earlier. Its debt supercycle ended at the end of the 80s, actually, but it's still facing that horrible rise in public sector debt. The thing about public sector debt is once governments start running deficits, they kind of get embedded. It's much easier to increase spending than to cut it. It's much easier to lower taxes than to increase them. And there is a horrible demographic background to this that I'm sure you're all aware of. Aging societies, birth rates have fallen, life expectancy has risen. So populations are aging fairly dramatically across the world, in fact. Very extremely so in certain countries. It looks very extreme when you look at it in terms of the number of taxpayers, which I define as people aged 20 to 64, to the retirees, which is people over 64. If you take Japan, the most extreme example, back in 1960, there were almost 10 taxpayers for every retiree. So it wasn't a huge burden. It's now down to less than 2, and it's falling to like 1.3, I think, by 2050, according to UN population projections. So it's like every taxpayer's got an old person on their back. They have to fund them. It's pretty ghastly. Same trend, maybe not quite so extreme as in other countries. Think about Japan, not my favorite, it's not a favorite, but it tells you the scope of the problem. They sell more adult diapers in Japan than they do baby ones. Fact, scary thought. Aging societies are really bad for public finances because old people require a lot of medical care, and of course pensions increase. and it's baked in the cake. So look, I've had 50 years of experience in economic and market forecasting, and the only thing I've really, really learned in that 50 years is that you can't forecast the future. Who the hell knows? It's not just me that doesn't know. I don't think anybody does. Even the people controlling the dials and turning the knobs at the central banks, they don't know either. Bit scary thought, but it's true. But I love demographics because that's a lot more certain. If you want to know how many 70-year-olds there are in 10 years' time, just count how many 60-year-olds there are today. Kill a few of them off according to mortality statistics, and you've got a good... So the demographics is a fact, and it's bad for government finances. The Congressional Budget Office in the US, which does these, it's a bit like their Office of Budget Responsibility, I suppose, a bit better than them. They project out government finances based on current policies out into the far future, and they just show rising deficits as a share of GDP as far as the eye can see. And that's with a good economy. They don't ever forecast recessions in there. And it's the rising cost of what they call entitlement programs, basically healthcare and Social Security. And it's embedded in the system. And because of that, the debt-GDP ratio just keeps going up through the roof, 180% by 2050. And it would be true in the UK as well. It's out there as a known issue. This is public data. Everybody knows about it. Everybody talks about it. A lot of hand-wringing. Great for political cartoonists there with a little Uncle Sam skater with trying to catch this rather large debt lady. So why don't we do anything about it? We know about it. It's not coming out of the blue. We've known about it for years. There's lots of articles in the papers about our debt problems. The reality, the sad reality, you like it. Politicians like it. You're the beneficiaries. You want the government to fix the roads. You want the governments to pay your pension. You want the governments to be able to treat you, if you turn up at the hospital without having to wait. You don't want your taxes to go up. So you actually like profligate. You like the benefits of profligate governments. And the politicians love it too. It's much more fun if you're a politician to say you're cutting taxes and you're improving the roads in your community than to say, sorry, but I'm going to have to cut your winter fuel benefits. That's no fun as a politician. If I was in the US, God forbid, and I was running for Congress, here's my election platform. I know you're very concerned about the high level of debt and deficits. I know this is one of your big issues that worries you for your children and your grandchildren. I am standing on a platform of means testing Social Security benefits, raising taxes, cutting back spending on a whole range of products, and my policies will bring the deficit back to a very low level. Vote for me. Any chance? I don't think so. The Pew Research Center in the US a few years ago did this survey. You probably won't be able to read all these numbers at the back. Doesn't matter. Asking people, okay, if you're in charge of the federal budget, what would you do about spending? So you've got veterans benefits, highways, Medicare, environment, healthcare, Social Security, defense, blah, blah, blah. And they've got the choice of increasing spending, keeping it the same, or decreasing it. What do you think people wanted to do? 72% increase veteran benefits, 22%. Well, no, actually, look at the last column, the decreased spending. Nobody wanted to. In the programs that really matter, people did not want to cut spending. They wanted to either increase it or keep it the same. Politicians aren't stupid. Well, they are, but but they understand this. Our government has just announced they're going to be really tough to fix the £22 billion hole that they've inherited from the Tories. Do you think they're going to really deal with the underlying issues? Of course not. Of course not. So if the voters aren't going to do anything about it because they like it, The politicians don't really want to deal with it because it's not vote winning. Where does the discipline come from? Who is going to exert pressure on governments to do the right thing? Well, there are a set of policemen out there, actually, who do have the power, and it's the financial markets, principally currency investors and bond investors. They have the power to force changes in policy. And countries that have so-called hit the debt wall, and there have been some in the past, New Zealand, Canada, Scandinavia, Iceland, they have been forced to change policy when the markets punish them. And we saw it in the UK with Liz Truss's ill-judged economic plans, with the bond and currency markets freaked out. It killed her plans and killed her premiership too. So the policemen have power. But in the US, where the fiscal trends are horrendous, this is where my second quote is relevant. James Carville wanted to come back as a bond market so we can intimidate everybody. So-called bond vigilantes. They're the people that are supposed to force a government to do the right thing. Well, where are they? I think they're effectively, those policemen are in the coffee shop eating donuts, effectively, because look at the S&P, the dollar's strong. If the bond market was freaked out about fiscal trends, you would expect long-term yields to be much higher than shorter-term yields. They'll put a fiscal risk premium in the yield structure, and there isn't. So the markets don't care. The financial policemen don't seem to care. Why is that? I can't really explain that. I mean, markets are markets. One day they care, and the next day they won't. But debt arithmetic, as that title says, is absolutely brutal. It doesn't self-correct. It only gets worse. So as the debt goes up, unless interest rates are zero, which they aren't anymore, your interest rates, the cost of servicing the debt goes up, so your interest costs absorb a greater and greater share of your revenues, so you get less money for other things. Government debt is a bit like a Ponzi scheme. I'm sure you all know what a Ponzi scheme is. Basically, it relies on selling debt to new borrowers so you can pay off the old ones. And it works fine as long as you can do that. As long as you can sell the new debt to people at an interest rate that the economy can live with, that's great, because you get money coming in from new investors, you pay off the old maturing bonds, and the show goes on. But at some point, it doesn't go on. At some point, the new investors don't materialize, and that's when Ponzi schemes collapse, when you can no longer find new suckers to pay off the old ones. So this is the path of what US call mandatory spending. It's entitlements, social money that the government has to spend, whether it likes it or not. Pensions, healthcare, and interest costs. By the 2050s, it will be 125% of revenues. So this is my other third quote. If something's unsustainable, it will stop. That won't happen. Inconceivable. So at some point, between now and then, the financial policeman will emerge from the coffee shop and say, I don't like these bonds anymore. And whether it's a US hedge fund or a Chinese investor or who knows. But at some point, the bond vigilantes, maybe James Carville will be one of them, will re-emerge, and there will be a crisis. There will be the financial crisis that other countries have faced, and governments will have no option other than to deal with it. Which countries are most vulnerable? Well, the horizontal scale is the underlying government deficit as a share of GDP, and the vertical scale is the amount of debt as a share of GDP. So you don't want to be up there at the top right. You've got the worst of both worlds. You've got a lot of debt and you've got high deficits. And these guys down here are the good guys. They don't have much debt and their deficits are small. So the bad ones are Japan, Italy, US, UK, France, Belgium, Spain. They're in a place you don't want to be. The good guys down here, Denmark, Switzerland, Canada, Sweden, Australia. Maybe Germany. So these are the guys that face some kind of denouement at some point. You're going to ask me when it's going to occur. I haven't the faintest idea. I really don't know. Don't think anybody does. So what happens? So we get a crisis. What does that actually? What do governments do? I mean, the crisis itself is a crisis. Is when stock market collapses, bond yields go up, currency falls, economy goes into recession. That's the nature of a crisis. So what do governments? What can they do about it? Well, they can raise taxes. They can reform the benefit programs that are causing the real problem. They can cut discretionary spending. They can sell assets if they own any. They can have some higher inflation. Higher inflation is great for debtors. It worked miracles in the 70s. You know, you borrow $100 and you wait 10 years and you pay back devalued dollars because of inflation. It's really only worth 10. And you have something that Russell knows a lot about, financial repression. So those are the options that they'll have, and governments will do a bit of everything. Now, raising taxes depends on what your tax structure is. The US, by the way, is the lowest taxed industrial country in the world other than Ireland, if you take account of all forms of taxation. So they actually do have scope to raise taxes. The UK, we've got pretty high tax burdens here. So if you raise taxes too much, you crush the economy, which undermines revenues, and it's self-defeating. So benefit programs, that's an easy one. Means test them. I mean, pension systems were generally put in place at a time when life expectancy was the same as the retirement age. I think in the US it was 1935 or something, and life expectancy was around 60, and you got a pension at 60. They didn't think many people would live long enough to actually get ever much of a pension. They never anticipated people living 30 years on a government pension, going out and playing golf or whatever. Nuts. They never raised the threshold for payments as life expectancy went up. So that's a no-brainer. You can raise the retirement age, you can means test. Rich people, you could argue, shouldn't, or the wealthy shouldn't get as much as the less wealthy, even if they paid into the system, too bad. Anyway, things can be done. Discretionary spending is what everybody wants to cut, but in a lot of places that's cut to the bone. You know, supporting beekeepers and things like that. You can cut all that out, but it's peanuts. Get rid of government waste, peanuts. You know, it's a shrinking share of government spending, so the opportunities to sort your problem with that are limited. Sell assets if you own some. The government can sell its national parks to Disney World, to Disneyland. The US still has a 43% share of NatWest or something. Anyway, but that's like a one-off thing. It's not solving the problem. It's like the asset-rich, income-poor aristocracy selling off the family silver. It's good for a year, but it doesn't solve your underlying problem. Tolerate higher inflation, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great solution. But you have to fool the bond market. The bond market was fooled in the 70s, so the government got away with it. If the bond market figures out what you're doing, it'll push yields up to a level that, you know, your debt arithmetic still kills you. So you have to find a way to fool the bond market, or financial repression, which means that you manipulate rates to a lower level than the market really would set them at. And you can do that by the central bank buying the bonds that the private sector doesn't want, quantitative easing, we've seen a lot of that. Or you can change regulations that force banks and other institutions to own more government debt on the grounds that it's good for their capital ratios, whatever. Governments will end up doing a mix of those things. The world will not end, you know. At some point we'll have a crisis, policy changes, some of these things will happen. life will go on. Hopefully at the end of it, government finances will be put on a more sustainable path. If something cannot go on forever, it will stop. So we are on an unsustainable path of fiscal trends, therefore something will change, and it will probably have to be the financial policemen that force it. It will be a bit ugly, but hey, it is what it is. I'm just the messenger. I'm done.
I think it's quite amusing that you stop forecasting the future, having spent 50 years forecasting the future. It's
futile. It's a futile way to earn a living.
As soon as you can shirk the responsibility, you've shirked it. So, but actually, there's quite a lot in there forecasting the future. Just on the data, you showed that wonderful chart graph of public sector debt. We know that UK household debt to GDP is coming down, American household, but there's a few countries actually where even the private sector hasn't got the message yet. So can you remind us?
Canada would be one of those, actually.
Canada. Who else is on that list?
Canada avoided, and I was living there at the time. I lived in Canada for 34 years until just a couple of years ago. It avoided the housing meltdown, which is amazing given its big neighbour to the south. So they never learned the lesson, if you like. So Canadian consumer indebtedness is incredibly high. And people have been worried about that for many years.
But if something cannot go on forever,
yes,
it will stop.
And housing, real estate prices in Canada are very, very high. So that's an accident waiting to happen.
Australia?
You'll have a book about that on your shelves in a couple of years.
Australia, similar?
Yeah, maybe similar. Yeah.
South Korea, actually, quite similar.
Yeah.
Norway, Sweden.
Well,
there's a few people
you can never generalize across every country with these things.
A few private sectors didn't get the message.
Australia, of course, is very relatively healthy public debt. Well, and so does Canada. So maybe that's the other side of the coin. Because the private sector hasn't imploded, the public sector is actually in decent shape.
Yeah. So you've seen a few, you've seen many debt cycles from 50 odd years. You've seen many times when it looked like it was going to fall apart. Yeah. What did everybody get wrong? Lots of people rushed out and said, that's it, the debt supercycle's over. What is it that they got wrong that said this thing's got another leg up in it?
Well, I'm not sure anybody ever really said the debt supercycle was over at that point. I mean,
I think Jim Grant.
I think maybe what we were Jim Grant. We've underestimated probably the willingness and the ability of the authorities to inflate the system. Mario Draghi's will do whatever it takes. I mean, who would have ever predicted quantitative easing on the scale that we saw, the Bank of England or the Fed stepping in and buying billions and billions and billions of government debt? Nobody would have believed that. If you'd suggested that to the Fed governors earlier, you guys are going to be doing this in a few years, they would have just laughed at you. So we've probably underestimated the willingness and the ability of the authorities to inflate the system. But what's different is that it stopped working for them. That's what's so interesting.
Obviously, we have to get to your last suggestion, financial repression. Maybe we should explain it in a bit more detail. So you have the high inflation, which I think was 0.5, and then everybody in this room who has savings is forced to own government bonds at yields below the rate of inflation. What I find interesting is we ran that after World War II, and in 1957 the Prime Minister said, "You've never had it so good." And that's true for debtors, because it was true for debtors, but it wasn't true for savers.
No.
So financial repression, could you just explain there's a wealth distribution element in that approach.
Yeah, of course.
Maybe you could explain.
Well, I mean, if the essential problem is you have too much debt, you have to shift the pain from the debtors to the creditors, don't you? So I can't afford to pay you the money back that I owe you, so tough. And
So inherently we just think that's inflation, but it's more than inflation because I have to force you to own these instruments that yield less than the rate of inflation. So there's another element to that which I don't think we fully consider.
It just falls under the category of governments. They'll just be forced to adopt whatever strategy is open to them. And it might be easier to inflict pain on creditors than to raise the retirement age to 70.
Well, we're both, actually I can see it from here, we have a book here called Capital by Thomas Piketty, the well-known Marxist economist.
Yes.
And he has in there a distribution of wealth chart, infamous one. Probably wake up screaming at night when you've looked at it. But one of the great redistributions of wealth actually comes after World War II, because we're doing financial repression, because there's relief for debtors and pain for creditors. So do you think somewhere in policy circles they're thinking, not only is this good for debt, this is good for wealth redistribution, let's do this? Or do they stumble into it? Is there some Machiavellian great design going on here, or is this just going to stumble into it?
I think they stumble into it. I think in the event of a true crisis, they'll be desperate. They'll be desperate. They'll be clutching at every straw that they can grasp. Because they won't be able to solve the problem with any one of those things. They'll never be able to raise taxes enough to deal with it, because that becomes self-defeating if you just crush the economy. Cutting the entitlement benefit programs is politically really treacherous. Discretionary spending is already cut to the bone. Some governments have assets. Not everybody has a lot of assets to sell. The inflation, to me, is the easiest one. That, to me, it worked, as I said earlier, it worked really well in the 70s. If you can fool the markets to accept higher inflation, you just devalue the debt. Wonderful if you can get away with it.
Which we've actually done quite successfully from 2022 to the end of last year. Nominal GDP growth was quite high. The price of government debt was falling. Your charts for government debt to GDP actually briefly had surged at COVID and then it came back down again because you surprised and ambushed the bond investor.
A little bit.
But it's
a little bit. I think the bond markets have been remarkably calm, if you like, in the last couple of years.
It's difficult to ambush somebody more than once. This is the problem. Yeah. So I've got a reputation for talking about this.
Yes. You know infinitely more about that than I do.
I just want to tell you a story about this. I was recently asked to speak at a party political conference, which I thought was interesting because I've never done that before. And they wanted me to speak on financial repression. I thought, well, that's interesting. Why would they want that? And the party, I can now reveal, was the Communist Party of Cyprus. And I thought about it for a while. I thought, when I write about financial repression as a danger for people and its savers, the Communist Party of Cyprus sees it as a how-to guide. So I think you're absolutely right. I think they've stumbling. But I think there's something beginning to form somewhere in the back of the mind that the 1945 to 1979 playbook, well, Adair Turner, who's written the book, is in here, is actually recommending.
Well, the US, after the war, pegged the Treasury yield at 2%. Yeah. Kept it there for many, many, many years. Yeah. So there are lots of politicians watching this live stream. Well, of course there are.
And they're looking down this. They're looking down this menu for ideas. You may have given them maybe too many ideas. We are in the Library of Mistakes. 50 years as an economist. Let's get slightly away from this. This might be a very long answer. What are the biggest mistakes that economists make? 50 years you've been observing the profession. Is there anything you would say, as many as you like, but not more than an hour and a half?
God, if I talk about my mistakes, I could fill this library on my own. I think the biggest change I have noticed from when I started. So I started out in January 1973 in the forecasting division of British Petroleum in London. Even that was an interesting move because the city was booming at that time and they were losing people into the city. And here was me wanting to join this boring industry where oil prices had been stuck at $2 forever and were never ever going to go up. Why would I want to? Anyway, I lucked out because in October that year, with the October War and oil prices went through the roof. In those days, forecasting, there was no internet. The data came in the post with a huge lag. We had no idea of up-to-date economic trends. You would see stories in the newspapers, but and even much later on, when I was at Wood Mackenzie, now we're into the 70s and 80s, still no internet. If the chairman of the Fed gave a speech, unless I could read what was reported in the paper, I had no idea really what he said. So we had time to think about long-term big issues because we didn't have all this data to parse over. We had no friggin' idea. So we spent a lot more time thinking about issues, and now we're overwhelmed with data. Oh my God, you've got access to every statistical release by every government, every month, every day. And I think economists spend way too much time focused on this month's retail sales or next month's inflation data. Who gives a damn? I mean, none of that stuff really matters in a bigger scheme of things. And people are far too short-term focused, trying to catch the short-term nuances in the economy and not spending enough time on the long term. I mean, as an investor, if you had caught the big themes and the big trends in the last 20 years, 30, 40 years, 50 years, that's all you needed to do. If you were smart enough to figure out that inflation was going up in the 70s and it was a problem, and the bank analyst, the company I joined in 1987, figured it out. I take no credit because I long before my time, but they were really bearish on inflation. They saw what governments were doing, so it made them bullish on gold. It made them worried about the stock market. They caught that wave, so you were in the right assets. If you knew inflation was going to go up and it was going to be a long-term trend, you could be invested for that. And similarly, when Volcker changed his policies at the end of the 70s and inflation turned, you're never going to catch it right away. But if you'd cottoned on, wow, the inflation era is over, and for the foreseeable future, inflation is going down, interest rates, which were 10, 12, 15. God, I remember an 18% mortgage rate here in the UK, just about killed me. If you'd figured out that that was the peak of interest rates and that interest rates were likely to come down and ridden that wave, that's all you needed to do. Catch the big long-term themes and don't worry so much about the short-term ones, because the short-term, who the hell knows?
There's a quote from Adam Smith. I've never been able to find it since I read it. He said, "The greatest cause of distress amongst men of wealth is the belief that they have to do something."
Right.
So inactivity, studied inactivity.
Well, spend a bit more time thinking about the long term, worry less about the short term, maybe would be one lesson, because, the message from 50 years of forecasting is, I've said this to somebody in the audience, that the future is essentially unknowable.
Well, you can say that now that you're retired.
Well, the Fed,
Before you put me
the Fed, not just the Fed, the IMF, the OECD, any major forecasting organization with very smart people, great models, lots of data, have failed to forecast every recession in the last 50 years. Completely failed. I looked at it. I did a report on it. I looked at their economic forecasts at the time the economy was actually peaking, and they were always forecasting continued growth.
Okay, let's ask you a practical question. You're redesigning the economic syllabus. Is there something you put on that syllabus today to improve economics? Is there anything that you think, beyond the advice of think more and less look at the data,
good grief.
Is there anything that should be on that syllabus?
Common sense.
Okay.
Less faith in models. In my time, and maybe it's true now, there was economics as a profession became far too quantitative, focused on econometrics and modelling everything. And these models are destined to fail because they're all based on mean reverting to past norms, and the future is always going to be different to the past, so models can never work. So I would make it maybe more Adam Smith.
Okay.
And less modelling.
I was hoping you'd say that. Before you put me out of a job by saying you can't forecast the future, it's time...
Oh, I've got opinions, but I just think they're going to be wrong.
It's time to go to the audience for questions. So who would like to ask Martin a question?
See, they're all stunned.
Well, this has never happened before. Anyway, here we go. Michael, just there.
Thank you. The chart you showed showing the country's GDP national debt, that's the one, sorry, not that one, the one you just...
That one.
That one. That's very similar to the Maastricht criteria, which said that basic guidance was you should keep total debt within 60% of GDP and the annual budget deficit no more than 3% of GDP. And what you're saying is that the safe countries, as it were, seem to be within those limits. So maybe they weren't bad guidelines. Yeah. At that time, it wasn't a rule because there were two countries within the European exchange rate mechanism back in the early 90s that exceeded it, Belgium and Ireland. Ireland had a GDP, national debt to GDP ratio of about 100%. Today, Ireland, I think, has a GDP ratio within... It fulfills both Maastricht criteria, and its budget surplus is not far off. I've been informed the UK's budget deficit. So this is remarkable for a country that's 10% of less than 10% of the UK's population, and it may be quite an interesting case study. What happened in Ireland? Obviously, it did have a crisis, and property prices collapsed. But one thing they did was they set corporation tax at 12.5% of GDP. And I think they'll be obliged by the European Union to put it up to 15%. But it's quite an interesting case study, and I wondered whether you had any comment on what's happened in the Republic of Ireland since the early 90s, the Maastricht criteria introduced, that's brought it from being what was seen as a basket case to being quite a successful economy today.
I don't have any specific knowledge or comments on Ireland, but New Zealand, which it's not on here, but it's over there. It's not in a bad place. Canada, where I was living at the time in the 90s, faced a debt crisis. Its interest payments were absorbing 33% of spending, whatever, and they turned themselves around. They they brought spending under control. I think they raised some taxes, and it worked. New Zealand faced a horrendous crisis. Iceland, I don't know what Iceland's status is now, but faced with no choice, they do it. The US, by the way, ran surpluses under Clinton in the 90s. It's probably impossible to do that now because entitlement spending has gone up so much. It was easier back then.
But while we've got this chart up, the striking thing on this chart is one currency, one nominal interest rate, two different countries, Germany and France.
Right.
What does that mean? How can you have one currency, one interest rate, radically different debt prospects, and this is also true in the private sector? What does that mean for the Eurozone to have this? Because that gap wasn't there. As Michael says, France started much nearer to here. Not down there, but nearer there, and it's gradually drifted up. What does this mean for a single currency?
Well, you got Italy as well. Don't forget Italy.
Yeah.
We went through the Greek crisis. I question the viability of the euro long term. I don't think it's been a great success.
Well, let's put it this way. These guys want moderate interest rates. These guys want really low interest rates. Who wins?
Germany.
Okay.
I would think.
Okay.
It's got the most muscle. But back to your thing about the Maastricht. It'll be on the shelves here somewhere, I'm sure. Rogoff, Reinhardt,
Yep.
This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Fiscal Folly. It was a very celebrated book, published in 2011, I believe. They studied financial crises back for 8 centuries. And they concluded that, I think they said 90% was a trigger point for a crisis. that if your government debt GDP go over 90, I think that's right.
Yeah, there's been some debate about the data,
Watch out.
and it's refuted by
Well,
some people.
yeah,
So,
but you know, we've already broached that in many, many countries, and no crisis, but it will happen.
okay, next question.
Hamish.
I was interested in the chart. I wondered when you were going to come on to it about the cost of all the debt. I gather in America, in about 2050, it'll be more than to service the debt will be more than the healthcare and one of the other big sectors as well. It's $830 trillion.
It's remorseless. I mean, it would just keep going up and up and up. Eventually, it would be 100% if you just extrapolate out to infinity. So, i.e., it won't happen.
You had a slide just a moment ago with a whole cluster of countries on.
Yeah. That one?
Yes. Now, you mentioned New Zealand briefly, but poor old Portugal is quite an outlier. Now, what's so special or unfortunate about Portugal?
I don't know. I am no expert on Portugal.
I think it's the legacy of the last crisis. So in the Eurozone crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, we had something called the pigs, very horrible term. Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece and Spain.
Right.
Spain and Portugal haven't really worked off the huge debt burdens from the last crisis. As Michael mentions, Ireland has, but Greece hasn't, despite charging off some of that debt. Actually, Greece has got very high debt to GDP. So these guys are still living with the legacy of bailing out their banks in the last crisis.
Thank you.
I'm still a wee bit flummoxed because you said on the one hand it's really hard to predict stuff, but your favourite phrase was if something is unsustainable, it has to stop.
Yes.
Which is in itself a prediction that.
Yeah, but I don't have the date.
No, but it will stop. It will stop.
Yes, of course.
But the other thing, just on the numbers, is my understanding for the UK, the debt you're using is just the sort of debt, not the off-balance sheet debt like public sector pension liabilities. So actually, the real debt in the UK is nearer 200%.
Well, is it not bad enough for you what I've shown? You want to make it worse? Yeah, of course, this unfunded liabilities, but if you're on a pay-as-you-go pension scheme, you know, you could argue you shouldn't really include those, but there's massive unfunded liabilities in the UK and the US.
I think the point is the quantum. You're right on the quantum. The quantum is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Therefore, maybe your favourite quote of the three will come sooner than we realise.
Well, again, there's nothing new in this unfunded liability point. We've known about it for a long time. So you could have said the same thing 5 years ago.
Martin, you talk about government debt with charts. You talk about the private sector with charts. You don't do total charts, total debt. And is that significant?
Your first chart.
No, it wasn't total. I didn't bother with a total one because my story has really been about the transition from the private to the public. But private debt is bigger than public debt. But total debt is obviously, over the decades, has gone up massively. So
I think the first chart is private non-financial. Is it private?
Private non-financial.
Private non-financial.
Oh yeah, just private.
Just private.
But yeah, so.
So I happen to know the numbers. So
there you go.
1947. I don't get 45. The total debt to GDP ratio for America is 120%. So that's the government plus the households plus the non-financial corporations.
Right.
120%. Having just fought a world war, and it's now roughly 240. So it's basically double where we were at the end of World War II when you add the three of them together. And that's not untypical for where we are. The difference is at the end of World War II, there isn't a lot of private debt. We've been through the 1930s. Right. We've, as you say, cleansed the system. So the difference today is there's excessive debt in both public and private. Not as bad as it was in the private household, but still pretty high by 1945 levels.
But of course, there's a huge difference between public debt and private debt. I mean, the private sector, you're limited to how much debt you can get into, because at some point the lenders will stop lending to you. You know, if you can't service it, you're done. You have to declare bankruptcy. So, but governments, they don't face those constraints because they can raise taxes, they can have the central bank buy the debt, whatever. So private debt is constrained by the willingness of lenders. Governments ultimately will be constrained as well, but it's a lot more elastic for governments than it is for the private sector.
So another question here.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture there. Just one comment. At the end, you seemed relatively sort of sanguine in your conclusion that there will be a crash. But are there reasons to believe that the absolute quantum of debt means it could be significantly worse than previous crashes? And I'm particularly just thinking about within your taxpayer bracket, sort of segmenting the younger generations, and if they are relatively have a lot less sort of capital than previous generations had, and if that will have an impact. So just to sort of within that, the demographics.
Well, I think
Thank you.
I may be wrong in this, actually. You'll correct me, Russell, very quickly. I would be more worried, I think, about private sector debt crises than public sector ones, in the sense that you saw that in 2007 to 2010. Anything that disrupts the credit system is very dangerous. You know, if you take out the banks and take out the financial sector, which effectively the burst US housing bubble did, you shut the economy down completely. I mean, I don't know if you remember the stories of all the ships in Singapore Harbour that were just out as far as the eye could see. They couldn't dock because they couldn't get unloaded because nobody would extend trade credit. I mean, there was crazy stuff like that was going on. I remember there was one statistic I remember for Japan. I don't know why it's stuck in my crazy mind. The economic data moves incrementally. You know, if you get a 1 or 2% move in a monthly data point, it's a big deal. I think it was Japanese machine tool orders or something fell 83% on the year. I mean, it was just something that was just beyond belief bizarre, because you shut the global credit system down. That was a private credit crunch. Government crises are nasty too, but they're solvable. You're not destroying your financial system, you're just destroying the government, basically. You know, they have to deal with it. They have to cut their spending and do the things I talked about. But I think private sector debt crises are more worrying than public ones. I don't know.
No, I absolutely agree with that. We mentioned some of the countries earlier that still have very high private debt: Australia, Canada, Norway, Sweden, South Korea. There's a few of them. Just in terms of the United Kingdom, the percentage of private sector income needed to service debt is about 13.5%. At the peak in 2007, it was closer to 20. So people don't realise that the balance sheets have been repaired to be
dramatically
but
improved.
we're expecting the same thing to happen in the UK as happened in 07, 08, but actually balance sheets are much better. Maybe for bad reasons, that lots of young people haven't got on the housing ladder, haven't taken mortgages, but for whatever reason that balance sheet's significantly better than people think it is.
But basically you don't want to take out the financial system. And going back to that very early chart of the pre-war period where you had all the multiple depressions, that was because, you know, in downturns you were taking out the financial system almost every time.
I was interested in your attempt cleansing the system, because as far as I know, the last member of a government to say that was called Andrew Mellon.
I didn't go with it.
Liquidate
I
stock,
know, liquidate the
capital,
farms, liquidate,
labour,
oh God, yes.
Cleanse the system. And no one's ever said it since, because of what happened next, the Great Depression, a Great Depression and a World War.
There is this Austrian school of economics that you may or may not be familiar with, that basically believe you should just let the financial market deal with things. Don't get the government involved in intervening, you just make things worse. And it's this idea that let the bad stuff go bust, and the system will be better off. It'll be better off for you in the end. I don't buy that at all, because it implies that that you find a floor. But the problem with, and Irving Fisher talked about this in his wonderful debt deflation theory of 1933, there's a danger that as the weak go under, they take the good with them, and it just spirals down. So you get a guy, a business that's really strong, great sales, nothing wrong with it at all, but the economy goes a downturn, and its customers stop paying them, and all of a sudden this good company doesn't look so good anymore, and it just spirals down, and maybe you don't find the floor, and maybe you just completely destroy everything. So I think it's right that the government should intervene to stabilise things. I don't buy the Austrian
So you do know
school at all.
there's only one good thing ever to come out of Austria. It's the Von Trapp family.
And schnitzels.
Sorry, two. No doubt we'll have some other
Vienna
suggestions.
tort. I don't know.
Sorry, this lady has a question.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. I'm not an economist,
Lucky you.
so you'll have to forgive me if I talk in rather lay terms. But I don't share your complacency. I don't think the world is going to go on as it has done. I don't think the present economic system is serving the world well at all. If you look at the outside world, rather than all this academic presentation, it's not in a good state. And there's a good argument, in fact, that democracy is not good for the world. And I just wonder what you would say to people like me who have a different way of thinking.
Oh dear. What I would say, cheer up.
You're wishing
I mean,
questions had
depends.
stopped before.
Well, I suppose it really depends on what you see as the underlying problem. And I've been talking about government finances, which are, in theory, fixable. I mean, it's like if you're overweight, just eat less. I mean, if you're in deficit, spend less. Makes it sound very simple, but you're talking about something rather more about the nature of democracy itself and politics and Trump and God knows what. I mean, that would give me much. Well, it's proved remarkably resilient. I mean, lots of countries, we talked about some of them, have gone through crises in the past and got their act together. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that the countries that currently look a bit dodgy can get their act together. But there's other reasons to be concerned about the world. It might be the environment, it might be politics, it might be all that stuff. And yeah, sure. But I never believe in worrying about things that I have no control over. So what can I tell you? I would hate to be that depressed. I think the world is completely screwed. I mean, I've got children and grandchildren, like many of us.
I should have said at the beginning, he's from Glasgow.
But I left as soon as I could.
A naturally more optimistic outlook on life, which we should all learn from. It's been a wonderful, just over an hour. An economist who can speak in English. It's a rare thing. And no wonder you've been so successful for 50 years. So, Martin, thank you very much.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
There are drinks at the back of the room, so please stay, have a conversation.
We all need one after that. If the world is ending, we drink and be happy.
And just one more thing, there are plenty more events to come, so keep an eye out.